March 14, 1945. Somewhere in western Germany, 12 miles from the Rhine. The village had no name worth remembering. Not on the maps carried by American officers, not in the reports filed by battalion headquarters. Just a cluster of stone houses arranged along a dirt road that disappeared into fields of frozen mud. The kind of place soldiers passed through without noticing, marked only by how many hours it took to clear, how many rounds were expended, how many casualties were sustained in the taking. By mid-afternoon, the shooting had stopped. The Wehrmacht defenders had withdrawn during the night, leaving behind the usual debris of retreat. Abandoned equipment. Burned documents. Empty ammunition crates stacked against barn walls. The Americans moved through the streets with practiced caution, checking doorways, clearing basements, scanning rooflines for snipers who might have stayed behind. They found none. What they found instead were civilians. Old men with faces carved by years of labor. Women clutching children who stared with eyes that had learned too young what soldiers meant. A few families had fled. Most had stayed, because where else was there to go? The roads were clogged with refugees. The cities were rubble. This village, for all its poverty and isolation, was still home. Company C had been fighting for 9 months. Since Normandy. Through the hedgerows of France, where every field was a kill zone and every tree line hid German positions. Through the bitter winter in the Ardennes, where men froze to death in foxholes and the snow turned pink with blood. Through the industrial wasteland of the Rhineland, where every factory had been converted into a fortress and every street corner became a shooting gallery. They were exhausted. Not the kind of tiredness sleep could cure, but the deeper exhaustion that comes from watching friends die, from killing men whose faces you remember, from carrying the weight of survival while others didn't. Some had been with the company since the beaches. Most of those were dead now. The replacements arrived in batches, wide-eyed teenagers who learned quickly or died quickly, and after a while the veterans stopped learning their names until they'd survived long enough to matter. Captain Morrison commanded the company. He was 26 years old and felt 50. Before the war, he taught history at a high school in Pennsylvania. He used to tell his students about the Great War, about trench warfare and poison gas and the lost generation. He'd made it sound noble, a tragedy perhaps, but still somehow meaningful. Now he knew better. There was nothing noble about mud and fear and the smell of bodies rotting in spring sunshine. The order came down from battalion around 1,600 hours. The village was to be destroyed. Not just cleared, but eliminated. Every building burned. Every structure reduced to rubble. The reasoning was tactical and coldly logical. German forces were retreating toward the Rhine, but they weren't beaten. They kept counterattacking, using villages as strongpoints, turning every cluster of houses into a defensive position that cost American lives to overcome. This village sat on a road the Germans might use. Its stone buildings could shelter troops. Its barns could hide tanks. Its cellars could stockpile ammunition. Better to deny the enemy these resources now than fight for this ground again later. The division had done this before. Standard procedure in the final push toward the Rhine. Burn the villages. Deny the enemy shelter. Keep the advance moving. Morrison received the order without comment. He'd learned not to argue with battalion. The men who gave orders from comfortable headquarters didn't want to hear about complications or moral qualms. They wanted results. They wanted progress marked on maps. They wanted problems eliminated efficiently. He called in his platoon leaders to relay the instructions. Lieutenant Garrett from 1st Platoon. Lieutenant Chen from 2nd Platoon. And Lieutenant Thomas from 3rd Platoon. They gathered in what had been the village schoolhouse, now serving as the company command post. A single room with broken windows and a chalkboard still showing arithmetic problems copied in a child's careful handwriting. Morrison explained the situation. The village would be evacuated and burned within the hour. Civilians were to be moved to a collection point 2 miles north where military government teams would process them. The men would use incendiaries and high explosives. Every structure was to be rendered unusable. No exceptions. Garrett nodded. He was a farmer's son from Iowa, practical and efficient. Destroying things was simpler than capturing them. Fewer casualties this way. Chen asked about the church. It was stone, nearly 300 years old, its bell tower visible for miles. Burning it might be difficult. Morrison said to use explosives if fire didn't work. The order said everything. That included the church. Lieutenant Thomas said nothing. He stood near the window, looking out at the village square where civilians were already gathering, shepherded by soldiers who kept their rifles ready and their expressions neutral. Thomas was 23 years old, quiet and deliberate, the kind of officer who spoke carefully and thought before acting. The men in his platoon respected him because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and because he had a way of making impossible situations feel manageable. Before the war, Thomas had studied engineering at a small college in Oregon. He'd planned to design bridges. He was good with mathematics, with seeing how forces distributed through structures, with understanding why things held together or fell apart. The army had made him an infantry officer instead, teaching him how to destroy rather than build, how to calculate fields of fire rather than load-bearing walls. Morrison finished his briefing. The platoons were to begin in 30 minutes. Any questions? Thomas asked how long the civilians had to gather their belongings. Morrison said they had whatever time it took to herd them to the collection point. This wasn't a humanitarian mission. This was a tactical necessity. Thomas nodded slowly. He asked if there had been any resistance from the village. Any snipers? Any evidence of German sympathizers? Morrison said no. The Wehrmacht had pulled out cleanly. The civilians appeared cooperative. That wasn't the point. The point was denial of resources to the enemy. Could they wait until morning, Thomas asked. Give the civilians time to collect food, clothing, essentials. The nights were still cold. Morrison's expression hardened. He'd been patient, but patience had limits. The order was clear and immediate. The company had lost 3 men yesterday taking the next village over, a village they should have burned a week ago when they first passed through. He wasn't going to risk more American lives because some German civilians needed extra time to pack. Thomas didn't argue further. He acknowledged the order and left to brief his platoon. But as he walked through the village toward where his men were gathered near the church, something turned over in his mind. Something that felt less like thought and more like physical discomfort, like a stone pressing against his chest. The villagers were being assembled in the square now. 60, maybe 70 people. Old men who moved slowly. Women carrying infants. Children clinging to their mothers' skirts. A few teenagers who tried to look brave and only looked frightened. They'd been told to bring what they could carry. Some had suitcases. Some had bundles wrapped in cloth. One old woman carried a single photograph in a frame, holding it against her chest like it was all that mattered in the world. Thomas watched them from a distance. He'd seen displaced persons before. France had been full of them. Belgium. Luxembourg. Endless columns of refugees pushing carts loaded with possessions, fleeing ahead of the fighting, trying to find somewhere safe in a continent that had run out of safe places. He'd learned to look past them. To see them as part of the landscape, like destroyed tanks or shell craters. Problems for somebody else to handle. But here, in this quiet village that had been liberated and would now be destroyed, the civilians weren't background. They were the consequence of the order Morrison had just given. They were what happened when tactical necessity met human reality. Third platoon was gathered near the church. 32 men, tired and dirty, some cleaning weapons, some smoking, some just sitting in silence with that 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing too much. Sergeant Walsh, the platoon sergeant, saw Thomas approaching and called the men to attention. Thomas told them to gather round. He explained the order. The village was to be burned. They would start with the eastern houses and work systematically west. Incendiaries first, high explosives for stone structures that wouldn't burn easily. The civilians were being evacuated. Once they were clear, the demolition would begin. Nobody reacted with surprise. They'd done this before. It was ugly work, but everything in war was ugly. At least they weren't going house to house with grenades and bayonets, which was how you cleared a village when the enemy was still inside. Private Kowalski asked if they were supposed to loot first. Some of the houses probably had food, liquor, valuables. The unspoken rule was that anything not nailed down was fair game before a village got torched. Thomas said no. They would evacuate the civilians, burn the structures, and move on. No looting. No delays. This was a military operation, not a shopping trip. Kowalski shrugged. It wasn't disappointment on his face, just acceptance. The rules changed depending on the officer. Thomas was known for following regulations. Some appreciated that. Some didn't. The men dispersed to prepare. They checked their incendiary grenades, white phosphorus munitions that burned hot enough to ignite anything. They inventoried their explosive charges. They marked which buildings to hit first on a map. It was mechanical work, the kind of task that required no thought and therefore no feeling. Thomas walked to the church. Its heavy wooden doors stood open. Inside, it was cold and dim, light filtering through stained glass windows that showed scenes from the Bible in faded colors. Pews lined up in neat rows. An altar at the front, simple and unadorned. The space smelled of old stone and candle wax. He stood in the doorway, looking at the interior. In a few hours, this would be rubble. The stained glass would shatter. The roof would collapse. The bell in the tower would fall and crack against stone that had stood for 3 centuries. And tomorrow, they would move on to the next village, and the day after that, the one beyond that, and eventually they would reach the Rhine, and after the Rhine, there would be more rivers, more villages, more burning. Something inside Thomas, something he'd been suppressing since Normandy, rose up and refused to be quiet anymore. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a clear thought. It was just a sense that what they were about to do was wrong. Not tactically wrong. Not militarily wrong. But fundamentally, essentially, morally wrong. He'd followed orders for 9 months. Good orders and bad orders and orders that made no sense at all. He'd done things that kept him awake at night. He'd killed men who were probably just like him, who probably wanted to go home just as badly as he did. He'd lost friends, watched them die, and kept moving forward because that was what soldiers did. But this order, here, now, felt different. These civilians hadn't resisted. They hadn't hidden German soldiers. They hadn't sabotaged American equipment or fed intelligence to the enemy. They were just people who had the misfortune to live in a village that sat on a road the army wanted to deny to the Germans. Was that enough reason to destroy everything they had? Was military efficiency worth the cost of homes and churches and the small dignities that made life bearable? Thomas didn't know. He wasn't trained to make philosophical judgments. He was trained to follow orders. But standing in that church, looking at the altar where generations had been baptized and married and mourned, he couldn't make himself accept it. Couldn't make himself start the work of destruction without at least trying something different. It was the kind of moment that defines a life. The kind of decision that separates those who obey without question from those who obey until conscience draws a line. Thomas had been a good officer. A dependable officer. The kind who never caused problems for his superiors. Now, for the first time since receiving his commission, he was going to cause a problem. He walked back to the company command post. Morrison was studying maps, planning the next day's advance. He looked up when Thomas entered, and something in Thomas's expression made him frown. "What is it, Lieutenant?" Thomas took a breath. He'd been rehearsing what to say, trying to find the right words that wouldn't sound like insubordination. But there were no right words. There was only what he believed. "Sir, I'm requesting permission to delay the demolition order until tomorrow morning." Morrison set down his map. His expression shifted from annoyance to something harder. "We've been over this, Lieutenant. The order is immediate." Thomas pressed on. "The civilians need more time. They've lived in this village their entire lives. Another 12 hours would let them gather essentials, say goodbye to their homes, process what's happening." Morrison stood up. His voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "The army doesn't run on sentiment, Lieutenant. We have a mission. That mission requires destroying this village tonight. Your feelings about it are irrelevant." "It's not sentiment," Thomas said. "It's practical. If we rush them, some will hide things, resist, slow us down. If we give them time, they'll cooperate. We'll complete the mission more efficiently." Morrison studied him for a long moment. "You don't believe that, Lieutenant. You're not worried about efficiency. You want to delay because you don't like the order." Thomas met his gaze. "No, sir. I don't like the order. But I'll follow it. I'm just asking for time to implement it humanely. Humanely. Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. We're burning a village. There's nothing humane about it. Adding 12 hours doesn't change that. It changes it for them, Thomas said. For the people who have to watch everything they know turn to ash. That's worth something. Not to battalion, Morrison said. Not to division. They want results. They want this village off the map by dark. Then I'll take responsibility, Thomas said. If battalion questions the delay, I'll explain it was my decision. Morrison shook his head. You don't have that authority, Lieutenant. I give orders to you. You don't negotiate with them. I'm not negotiating, sir. I'm requesting permission to execute the order in a way that maintains some human dignity. The tension in the room was palpable. Morrison could have ended this instantly. A direct refusal. A threat of insubordination charges. But something in Thomas's quiet determination made him hesitate. Maybe he saw something of himself before 9 months of war had worn him down. Maybe he remembered being a teacher who cared about how history judged actions. Or maybe he was just tired of being the man who gave terrible orders without question. 6 hours, Morrison said finally. You get 6 hours. The civilians are gone by 2200 /. The demolition starts at 2230 /. If you're not done by midnight, I'm sending Garrett's platoon to finish the job, and you'll explain to them why they're working all night because you wanted to play humanitarian. Thomas nodded. Thank you, sir. Morrison waved him away. Don't thank me. And don't make me regret this. Thomas walked back through the village with the weight of 6 hours pressing on him. 6 hours wasn't much. It was a compromise, not a solution. But it was something. A small act of mercy in a world that had forgotten mercy meant anything. He gathered his platoon near the church. The men sensed something had changed. Thomas was different somehow, less mechanical, more present. He told them about the delay. They would give the civilians until late evening to prepare. Then the demolition would proceed as ordered. Some of the men looked relieved. Others looked skeptical. Sergeant Walsh, who'd been in combat since North Africa, pulled Thomas aside. Lieutenant, we're going to do this no matter what. Delaying just makes it harder. Like pulling off a bandage slow instead of fast. Thomas nodded. Maybe. But they deserve the time. That's all I can give them. Walsh didn't argue. He'd served under officers who treated civilians like obstacles and officers who treated them like people. He preferred the latter, even when it complicated things. At least you knew where you stood morally. The word spread through the village quickly. The burning would wait until late evening. Not cancelled, just delayed. It was a small thing, maybe meaningless in the end, but to the civilians it felt like grace. Like someone had seen them as human beings worthy of consideration. An old man approached Thomas as he stood near the church. He spoke in German, which Thomas barely understood, but the meaning was clear from his gestures. He was thanking him. For the time. For the kindness. Thomas wanted to say there was nothing kind about what was coming, but the old man's eyes were wet, and his hand trembled as he reached out to shake Thomas's hand, and all Thomas could do was nod and accept the gratitude he didn't feel he deserved. The afternoon stretched into evening. The civilians moved through their homes with the slow deliberation of people trying to memorize everything. Touching walls they would never touch again. Looking at rooms where they'd raised children, celebrated holidays, mourned losses. Gathering what could be carried and grieving what had to be left behind. A woman in her 40s came to Thomas carrying a small wooden box. She explained in broken English that it contained letters from her husband, who had died in the first year of the war fighting for Germany. She couldn't carry much, but this she had to save. Thomas assured her she could keep it. She clutched the box to her chest and walked away crying silently. Children ran through the streets one last time, playing games that took on desperate intensity because they knew this was the last time. A boy maybe 8 years old stood outside a house touching the door frame, his fingers tracing the notches carved into the wood marking his height each birthday. Years of growth measured in small cuts in old wood. Tomorrow those marks would be ash. Thomas watched all of this. He couldn't stop it. Couldn't save the village or prevent what was coming. All he'd done was delay the inevitable by a few hours. But those hours mattered to the people living them, and maybe that was enough to justify the risk he'd taken by asking Morrison for time. As darkness fell, the platoon prepared for demolition. They assembled incendiaries and explosives. They marked structures systematically. The work had to be thorough. Battalion would send inspectors to verify the village was truly destroyed, unusable by German forces. Half measures wouldn't be tolerated. At 2,200 hours, the civilians were assembled in the square. They stood in clusters, families holding together, neighbors supporting those who were too old or young or broken to stand alone. The American soldiers formed a perimeter, not threatening but present, a reminder that this wasn't voluntary. Thomas counted them. 67 people. That was everyone. No one had tried to hide or stay behind. They understood what was happening now. Sergeant Walsh organized the escort to move them to the collection point 2 miles north. It would take about 40 minutes walking. Some of the civilians moved slowly. The very old, the very young. Women carrying babies. But they moved, one foot in front of the other, because there was no alternative. Thomas watched them file out of the village. A long column of displaced persons joining millions of others across Europe, people whose lives had been shattered by decisions made by men in uniforms and offices, men who spoke of military necessity and strategic requirements and all the bloodless language that made destruction sound reasonable. When they were gone, the village felt hollow. Buildings stood empty, doors open, windows dark. It looked abandoned now, ghostly, as if the people had never been there at all. Just structures waiting to be destroyed. The platoon moved into position. First Sergeant Walsh's squad on the east side. Corporal Davis's squad on the west. Private Kowalski and the machine gun team securing the perimeter in case German patrols stumbled on them during the demolition. Thomas stood in the village square and gave the order. Begin demolition. The first incendiaries went into the houses on the eastern edge. White phosphorus grenades thrown through windows, shattering glass, erupting inside with chemical fire that burned at 5,000 degrees. The flames spread instantly, consuming wooden furniture, climbing walls, racing across ceilings. Within minutes, the houses were engulfed. The men moved systematically west, house by house. Throwing incendiaries, setting charges, standing back as structures erupted in flame and smoke. The night sky turned orange. Heat rolled through the street in waves. The smell of burning wood mixed with other smells. Melting paint. Smoldering cloth. The acrid stink of white phosphorus. Thomas moved with his men, supervising, ensuring thoroughness, feeling each building's destruction like a physical blow. This wasn't combat. Combat had an enemy, a purpose, the raw necessity of survival. This was different. This was methodical elimination of human places for strategic reasons that felt increasingly abstract. They reached the church around midnight. It stood alone now, surrounded by burning houses, its stone walls reflecting firelight. The wooden doors. The interior pews. The stained glass. All of it about to be destroyed. Walsh approached with a satchel charge. Ready for the church, sir. Thomas looked at the building. 3 centuries old. Generations baptized and married and mourned here. A place where people had sought meaning in a world that often felt meaningless. In a few moments, it would be rubble. He thought about the old man who had thanked him for the 6 hours. The woman with the box of letters. The boy touching the door frame marked with his growth. All the small mercies and large griefs that made up human lives. And he thought about what was being destroyed here, not just buildings, but the evidence that people had lived and loved and mattered. The order was clear. Everything destroyed. No exceptions. Battalion would inspect. If the church stood, there would be consequences. Morrison would be reprimanded. Thomas would face charges. The mission had to be completed. But standing there in firelight with smoke drifting through the empty streets, Thomas made a decision that changed everything. Hold off on the church, he told Walsh. Walsh frowned. Sir, the order said everything. I know what the order said. Set charges on the bell tower. Make it look like we tried. But leave the structure standing. Lieutenant, that's not. That's an order, Sergeant. Walsh studied him for a long moment. He'd been a soldier long enough to recognize when an officer was taking a risk that could destroy his career. But he'd also been a soldier long enough to recognize when an officer was doing something because it was right rather than because it was ordered. "Yes, sir," Walsh said. "We'll make it look good." The platoon set charges on the bell tower, small ones, enough to damage but not destroy. They threw incendiaries into the interior, burning the wooden pews and furnishings but leaving the stone walls intact. When the charges detonated, the bell tower cracked, the bell fell, the roof partially collapsed. But the basic structure remained. By 0200 hours, the work was done. The village was destroyed. 63 houses reduced to smoking ruins. Barns collapsed. Fences burned away. The only structure still standing was the church, damaged but not eliminated, its stone walls dark against the fire-lit sky. Thomas stood in the square, surrounded by destruction, knowing he'd disobeyed an order. Not openly. Not dramatically. But deliberately and unmistakably. The church stood because he'd chosen to let it stand. Because something in him refused to destroy the one thing in this village that represented more than military strategy or tactical necessity. He didn't know what would happen now. Didn't know if Battalion would notice, or if Morrison would realize what had been done, or if there would be consequences that ended his career. He only knew that he'd reached a limit he couldn't cross. Sergeant Walsh approached, his face streaked with soot. "We're done here, sir. Should we withdraw?" Thomas nodded. "Withdraw to the western edge. We'll bivouac there until morning." The platoon pulled back from the burning village. The men were exhausted, covered in ash, ready to sleep wherever they stopped moving. They didn't ask about the church. Some had probably noticed. Others hadn't. Either way, they followed their orders, and Thomas was the one who would have to explain if questions arose. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of a shell crater, watching the fires burn down, thinking about the 6 hours he'd given the civilians and the church he'd left standing. Small mercies in a war that had forgotten mercy. Probably meaningless in the larger scheme. Probably not enough to matter. But they mattered to him. They were the line he'd drawn between military necessity and human conscience. They were the proof that orders didn't erase moral responsibility. They were his refusal to become the kind of officer who destroyed without thinking, who followed instructions without considering consequences. As dawn broke over the ruined village, Thomas saw smoke rising from collapsed houses, embers still glowing in the ruins. And above it all, damaged but defiant, the stone walls of the church catching the first light of morning. Captain Morrison arrived at 0630 hours with a jeep and 2 battalion staff officers. They drove slowly through the ruined village, inspecting the destruction, checking it against the orders. Thomas watched from a distance, his stomach tight with anticipation. He'd known this moment would come. Known that someone would examine the work and measure it against expectations. The jeep stopped at the church. The officers got out, walked around the structure, examined the damaged bell tower, looked through the scorched doorway at the burned interior. They conferred in low voices Thomas couldn't hear. Then Morrison turned and waved him over. Thomas walked across the square, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris. He didn't know what he would say if asked directly about the church. Lying felt wrong. But admitting deliberate disobedience meant a court-martial. Morrison gestured at the church. "Your work." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "Third platoon handled this sector." Morrison looked at the structure again. The roof still on. Stone walls intact. This could still shelter troops. "We set charges on the bell tower, sir. Burned the interior. The stone resists fire. We would have needed more time and explosives to completely demolish it." Morrison studied him. His expression was unreadable. "You had incendiaries. You had high explosives. You had time. Every other building in this village is rubble. This one's damaged but standing." Thomas met his gaze. "The stone construction made it difficult, sir. We prioritized the wooden structures and tactical positions. The church was last, and by then we were running low on explosives." It was a weak excuse. They both knew it. Morrison could press further. Could demand details. Could recognize the evasion for what it was. But instead, he turned to the battalion officers and said something Thomas couldn't hear. They nodded, made notes on clipboards, walked back to the jeep. Morrison waited until they drove off before speaking again. His voice was low, meant only for Thomas. "I know what you did, Lieutenant. I know you left it standing deliberately." Thomas said nothing. Confirming it made everything worse. Morrison continued. "Battalion doesn't care. They saw a damaged church with a collapsed tower and burned interior. That's sufficient for their reports. The village is denied to the enemy. Mission accomplished." He paused, looking at the church, then back at Thomas. "But I know, Lieutenant. And you need to understand something. What you did was insubordination. If I reported it, you'd face a court-martial. You'd lose your commission. Probably spend time in a military prison." Thomas nodded. "I understand, sir." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "But I'm not going to report it. Because I think maybe you were right. Maybe this war has made us forget that there's supposed to be a line between military necessity and simple destruction. Maybe somebody needed to draw that line, even if it meant disobeying orders." He gestured at the ruined village. "We've destroyed 100 villages like this one. Maybe 200. Some were legitimate tactical targets. Some were just in the way. We tell ourselves it's necessary, that it saves American lives, that the Germans would do worse if positions were reversed. And maybe that's all true. But at some point, we have to ask ourselves what kind of army we want to be. What kind of men we want to be when this war ends." Morrison looked tired. Older than his 26 years. "You gave those civilians 6 hours they didn't have to have. You left them a church they can come back to someday. It's small. It doesn't change the outcome of the war. But maybe it matters anyway." He turned to walk back to the command post. "Get some rest, Lieutenant. We move out at 1,400 hours." Thomas watched him go, feeling something release in his chest. The consequences he'd expected hadn't materialized. Morrison knew, but Morrison wasn't going to act on it. The church stood, and Thomas would keep his commission, and somehow that felt like more than he'd hoped for. Over the next few days, word spread through the company about what had happened. Not the full story, but enough. The men in 3rd Platoon knew their lieutenant had done something irregular. They didn't know exactly what, but they respected him more for it. Some officers ruled by fear or by authority. Thomas ruled by conscience, and that made him worth following. The civilians were eventually processed by military government teams and relocated to a displaced persons camp 20 miles north. They would stay there until the war ended, then begin the slow process of rebuilding lives from fragments. But they carried with them the memory of 6 hours they'd been given to say goodbye, and the knowledge that not everything had been destroyed. 3 weeks later, American forces crossed the Rhine. The war in Europe had less than 2 months left. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. German cities fell one after another. The Great Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was disintegrating into chaos and surrender. Thomas and 3rd Platoon fought through those final weeks. They took casualties. Lost men to random artillery shells and desperate last stands by fanatic defenders. They liberated concentration camps and saw horrors that would haunt them forever. They accepted German surrenders and processed thousands of enemy soldiers who looked more relieved than defeated. And through it all, Thomas carried the memory of that church standing in a ruined village. It became a symbol for him of something he struggled to articulate. Not heroism. Not victory. But the simple human choice to preserve rather than destroy when preservation was possible. The men in his platoon sensed this. They noticed that Thomas approached civilians differently after that night. Spoke to them with more patience. Ensured they were treated with basic dignity. Made small decisions that technically weren't part of any order but felt right in the moment. A delay to let refugees pass. A warning before artillery fire. A choice not to requisition food from people who had nothing. Sergeant Walsh once remarked to Corporal Davis that the lieutenant had changed somehow. Found a backbone nobody knew he had. Davis disagreed. Thomas always had a backbone. He just finally found a situation where he had to use it. The other platoon leaders noticed too. Garrett from 1st Platoon asked Thomas directly one evening how he'd gotten away with leaving the church standing. Thomas said he hadn't gotten away with anything. Morrison had chosen not to pursue it. That's different. Garrett shook his head. I couldn't have done it. Would have followed the order exactly. Burned everything. Battalion said destroy, so we destroy. Thomas understood that. Most officers would have done the same. He'd been lucky that Morrison was tired enough and decent enough to let it slide. If Battalion had been more thorough in inspection, if Morrison had been less sympathetic, the outcome would have been different. But it hadn't been different. The church stood. That was what mattered. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Celebrations erupted across the continent. Soldiers who'd survived felt numb more than joyful. The killing had stopped, but the memories remained. Thomas was in southern Germany when surrender came. His company had liberated a small town 2 days earlier without resistance. The Wehrmacht defenders had simply disappeared during the night, leaving behind weapons and vehicles and the hollow shell of an army that no longer existed. When word of surrender reached them, the men reacted with quiet relief. No cheering. No wild celebration. Just the slow realization that they'd survived, that they could go home, that the war that had defined their lives was finally over. Thomas stood in a town square, watching German civilians emerge from cellars and basements, watching American soldiers light cigarettes and talk in low voices about what came next. And he thought about all the villages they'd destroyed in the final push to the Rhine. All the places reduced to rubble for tactical reasons that seemed less urgent now that victory was achieved. He wondered if any of those places could have been spared. If any of those destructions had been necessary or just convenient. He would never know. The war was over. The villages were gone. All that remained were questions about whether it had to be that way. But one church still stood in one village 12 miles from the Rhine. That was something. Not much, but something. The soldiers went home. Slowly, in stages, as military transport became available and occupation duties were distributed. Thomas returned to Oregon in September 1945, stepping off a train in Portland to find a country that didn't quite understand what he'd been through. People wanted to hear war stories. They wanted tales of heroism and victory. They didn't want to hear about destroyed villages and moral compromises and the exhaustion that came from months of killing and being shot at. So Thomas learned to give them what they wanted, or to say nothing at all. He went back to college. Finished his engineering degree. Started designing bridges, which was what he'd wanted to do before the war interrupted everything. He was good at it. Understanding how structures distributed weight and stress came naturally to him. But he couldn't look at a bridge without thinking about the buildings he'd helped destroy in Germany. He married a woman named Sarah in 1947. She was patient with his silences and his nightmares. She didn't ask what he'd done in the war, which meant she was the only person he eventually told. Late one night, unable to sleep, he explained about the village and the church and the 6 hours and the order he'd disobeyed. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked a simple question. Do you regret it? No, Thomas said. It was the only thing I did in the war I'm actually proud of. They had 3 children. Thomas taught them about responsibility and conscience and the importance of drawing lines. He never told them the war story directly, but they absorbed the lesson anyway. That authority doesn't erase moral obligation. That orders aren't always right just because they come from someone with rank. That sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to participate in something wrong, even when refusal costs something. Years passed. Thomas built bridges across rivers and highways. He became respected in his field. The war receded into memory, though it never disappeared entirely. The men he'd served with scattered across the country, maintaining occasional contact through letters and rare reunions. Captain Morrison stayed in the army after the war. Rose to colonel. Retired in 1965. He and Thomas exchanged Christmas cards every year. Morrison never mentioned the church in those cards, but in 1957, he wrote something that seemed significant. I've been thinking about decisions we made in the war. Some I'm proud of. Some I'm not. The ones I'm proudest of are the times I let good men make better choices than I would have made alone. Thomas understood what that meant. Sergeant Walsh went back to Ohio, worked in a factory, raised a family. He wrote to Thomas once in 1952, asking if he remembered the church. Thomas wrote back saying he thought about it often. Walsh replied that he did too. That it reminded him soldiers were still human beings capable of mercy even when everything pushed them toward brutality. The village in Germany slowly rebuilt. The war had destroyed most of it, but stone foundations remained. New houses rose on old lots. Families returned from displaced persons camps. Life resumed in the stubborn way life always resumes after catastrophe. And the church still stood. Damaged but intact. The bell tower was rebuilt in 1948. New windows replaced the shattered ones. The interior was restored over several years. By 1953, services were being held there again. Thomas didn't know any of this until 1961, when he received a letter from Germany. It was from a man named Friedrich Kohler, who had been a boy in the village during the war. Kohler had managed to track down Thomas's address through military records and veterans organizations. The letter was in careful English. Kohler explained that he'd been 12 years old when the Americans destroyed the village. He remembered being terrified. Remembered the 6 hours the civilians had been given. Remembered watching the houses burn from 2 miles away, the sky orange with fire. He also remembered returning after the war and finding the church still standing. His family had attended services there when reconstruction finished. He'd been married there. His children had been baptized there. The church had become the center of the village's rebuilding, a symbol that not everything had been lost. Kohler had spent years trying to find the officer responsible for sparing the church. He wanted to thank him. To let him know that the decision had mattered. That it had given the village something to rebuild around, a connection to their past, proof that their history hadn't been completely erased. Thomas read the letter 3 times. Then he sat down and wrote a reply. He explained that he hadn't been trying to be a hero. He'd just reached a limit he couldn't cross. The church had survived partly through his decision and partly through luck that battalion hadn't inspected too carefully. Kohler wrote back. More letters followed. A correspondence developed between a former American lieutenant and a German man who'd been a boy during the war. They never met in person, but the letters continued for years, bridging the gap between former enemies, creating understanding through shared memory. In one letter, Kohler wrote something that Thomas kept and reread often. You gave us 6 hours to say goodbye and a church to come back to. It doesn't sound like much written down. But those 6 hours were the only kindness anyone showed us in those days. And that church was proof that we mattered to someone. That we weren't just obstacles to be removed. Thank you for seeing us as people. Thomas showed that letter to Sarah. She read it and cried. Then she told him she was proud of him. Not for what he'd done in the war generally, but for this specific act of mercy in a time when mercy was rare. As Thomas grew older, he thought more about that night in March 1945. It had been such a small thing in the context of the war. One village among hundreds destroyed. One church among countless structures demolished. A few hours delay in carrying out an order. A decision made in firelight by a tired lieutenant who couldn't bring himself to destroy everything. But small things compound. They create ripples. That church became a center for rebuilding. Those 6 hours gave people time to preserve memories they would have lost otherwise. And maybe, just maybe, Thomas's refusal to follow orders blindly reminded a few other officers that military necessity had limits. He couldn't know. The war had been too big, too chaotic. His actions were a grain of sand on a vast beach. But they'd been his actions. His line drawn. His refusal to participate fully in destruction when preservation was possible. The men who'd served under him in 3rd Platoon remembered. At a reunion in 1973, Sergeant Walsh, now gray-haired and heavy, pulled Thomas aside. You know what I think about when I remember the war? Not the battles. Not the fear. Not the friends we lost. I think about that church. About you deciding it didn't need to burn. That's the moment I remember because it proved we weren't just machines following orders. We were men who could still choose. Thomas didn't know how to respond to that. He'd never thought of himself as particularly moral or brave. He'd just been exhausted and conflicted and unable to destroy one more thing when destruction seemed unnecessary. But Walsh was right in a way. Choice mattered. Even small choices. Even choices that technically violated orders. They defined who you were more than obedience did. Thomas died in 1994, at age 72. He'd lived a good life after the war. Built bridges. Raised a family. Maintained friendships with men who'd survived experiences most people couldn't imagine. He'd wrestled with memories and nightmares, but he'd also found peace in knowing he'd done at least one thing in the war he could defend without qualification. At his funeral, Sarah placed a photograph on his casket. It showed a stone church in a German village, rebuilt and beautiful, its walls solid against a clear sky. Kohler had sent the photograph years earlier. Thomas had kept it on his desk, a reminder that mercy mattered even when everything suggested it didn't. The village still exists. The church still stands. Services are held there every Sunday. The bell that fell in 1945 was recast and rehung. It rings now for weddings and funerals and ordinary moments of community life. Nobody in the village today knows the name of the American lieutenant who spared their church. The story has faded into local legend, details lost to time. They know an officer disobeyed orders. They know someone chose preservation over destruction. But names and specifics have dissolved into history. That would have been fine with Thomas. He'd never wanted recognition. He just wanted to draw a line between what war demanded and what conscience could accept. He'd wanted to prove, if only to himself, that soldiers were still human beings capable of mercy even in the machinery of total war. The church remains. Stone walls. Stained glass. A bell tower reaching toward the sky. It's not a monument to anything grand. Just proof that one person chose differently in a moment when choice was difficult. That sometimes the most important acts of courage are quiet refusals to participate fully in destruction. March 14, 1945. A quiet lieutenant stood in a burning village and decided a church didn't need to burn. It was a small decision in an enormous war. But it gave 67 people something to return to. It gave a village a center to rebuild around. It gave a few soldiers proof they were still capable of mercy. And it reminds us, all these years later, that individual conscience matters. That orders don't erase moral responsibility. That the line between military necessity and simple destruction is real and worth defending. The church stands. That's what remains. A structure of stone and faith and the memory of one man's refusal to destroy everything just because destruction was ordered. In the end, that might be the only monument worth having. Not glory or victory or triumph over enemies. Just a church still standing in a German village because someone chose mercy when cruelty would have been easier.